Good morning, Excellencies, expert panel members, and our distinguished audience. I'm Sarah Sheikh, the Development Director at Family Educational Services Foundation, and I'll be moderating this side event for the 59th UN Commission for Social Development, titled Role of Technology in Fostering Inclusion for PWDs During COVID-19. It falls under the priority theme, Socially Just Transition Towards Sustainable Development, the role of digital technologies on social development and well-being of all. Our focus today is to examine the disability divide. We know that gaps existed before the pandemic, and now they have been further intensified. Currently, we're observing the largest digital gap between communities, and we find ourselves in a transformed world, a world that has more challenges for the vulnerable communities. As we move forward in the response and recovery efforts of COVID-19 pandemic, we need to restore the voices of individuals, and we need to bridge the supply and demand gap of digital technologies and make sure that we have some systems in place that are inclusive of all persons. Joining us today are Dr. Amina Zia, UN representative for FESF, Richard Carey, founder and director FESF, Ms. Fiza Shah, CEO Developments in Literacy, Mr. Raza Pirbhai, CEO at KFC Pakistan, Mr. Umair Ahmed, CEO at Now PDP. Ms. Mehreen Iftikhar from the Deaf Reach program will facilitate the event in Pakistan Sign Language. Dr. Amina Zia serves as a UN representative at the Economic and Social Affairs Committee, the UN ECOSOC, and she's also the founder of Blue Ridge Impact Consulting, a firm that specializes in social impact in the development field for public-private partnerships. Her expertise centers on engagement through multi-stakeholder approach in the core development community and beyond. And she actively participates in high-level political forums and commissions. I welcome now Dr. Amina Zia to deliver the opening remarks and set the stage for this conversation. Over to you, Amina.
Thank you, Sarah. Excellencies, distinguished delegates and participants, good morning. The meetings so far at this 59th Commission for Social Development have highlighted the need for digital transformation at new levels, especially as we find ourselves at a unique moment in history in the midst of a universal crisis that intersects all people everywhere. And of course, disproportionately, we know it impacts vulnerable communities and further marginalizes, compounding inequalities and inequities. I'm very appreciative of the discussions within the side event spaces like this one today, because I truly believe that they offer an opportunity for stakeholders to define and to contextualize challenges through a very holistic understanding, an understanding that is rooted in the need to facilitate and to scale knowledge and best practices. It is by leveraging our strengths and committing to actions through partnerships that we are able to embrace social development for all. So we, also find ourselves at this inflection point during this commission. It has been recognized repeatedly that we are at the beginning of a new technological revolution that calls for equality in the digitization of social services. And of course, there's a lot of potential for solutions to challenges. So we know that technologies can result in further isolation or even inequalities among those who are not connected and those who do not have access to get connected, and which further creates these hierarchies which are based on capacity and lack of connections. This is also most concerning for persons with disabilities, as many of their vulnerabilities overlap with gender gaps and rural-urban divide even, which results in this compounding effect on inequalities and inequities. At the United Nations Disability Inclusion Strategy, we noticed that about a year ago it was adopted, and it has supported efforts across agencies for inclusivity and accessibility. And since the adoption of the strategy, we're noticing that there is this kind of dialogue, this new dialogue around innovation and inclusion, with most of the conversation centering around development and how we bring in innovation and inclusion together in the conversation. So we need to make space for to maximize opportunities through very robust public-private partnerships, right? And we also need the political commitments, and we need multi-stakeholders as key drivers. So I'm looking forward to this very timely dialogue with all of you and with our distinguished panelists, and of course with our audience, as they focus on the needs to foster a very socially just transformations as we scale up innovations in education and perhaps redesign our cooperation strategies and facilitate knowledge sharing and innovative workforce development, and of course, all to improve digital connectivity. So I'm looking forward to all of our panelists and their contributions to this very timely discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Amina Zia. I'd like to introduce now Richard Geary, founder and executive director of Family Educational Services Foundation, a non-profit institution operating in Pakistan since 1989. Richard has worked in the field of social development for the past 47 years in various countries. He calls Pakistan his home, and under his directorship, FESF pioneered the Deaf Reach program in Pakistan, which is a unique academic and skills training program for deaf children and young adults, and utilizes innovative technology-based resources for education. Richard will be speaking on the importance of connectivity and digital literacy for PWDs and the need for a multi-stakeholder approach with partnerships. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to share some of our learnings and working together to find a way forward. I think this is a very timely discussion point, especially at this time. The whole COVID situation has obviously highlighted and exacerbated the challenges that children with disabilities particularly face. We've seen this in our own schools. We have schools for deaf children in Pakistan, the majority of whom are very underprivileged. They come from low socioeconomic backgrounds, families with low education backgrounds. And the pandemic has had a terrific impact on those families. Obviously, our schools had to close. Many of those family members lost jobs. So when we look, I'd like to step back a little though from just looking at the situation of the pandemic to discuss a little bit the broader topic here, because in Pakistan particularly, and I think this is the situation across most countries of the global south, I mean, there's a very high percentage of persons with disabilities. Based on a recent British Council report, up towards of 15% of the population have some disability. In Pakistan, out of 220 million people, that's roughly 30 million people. PWDs are highly marginalized, and especially from the education system and from employment. Thus, ultimately, they're undereducated, underemployed, which leads to a reduced quality of life. For example, deaf children in Pakistan, and now in Pakistan, there really are no real true demographics, but it's been estimated there are over at least 1 million deaf children of school age, and hardly 5 or 6% of them actually have access to education. And those that do are in the main urban areas. But schools for the deaf, the only schools for the deaf that exist in the rural areas are government schools. But yet upwards of 65% of the population live in rural areas. And deaf children in particular are highly marginalized. They're isolated in their homes, especially during this time of pandemic, as their family members don't converse with them in sign language. They then suffer a loss of language skills and obviously a discontinuance of their education for those that are going to school. For those that are already out of school, they have no access to even basic literacy skills. So creating access with digital content, whether that's online or offline, is a really important part of enabling and empowering persons with disabilities, particularly enabling them to have access information, access education, access employment opportunities, and thus create greater inclusion in the society, which is, again, a very big challenge. From our side, in terms of creating digital learning resources, we've worked over the past years to create digital learning content in sign language. We developed the first ever Pakistan Sign Language digital dictionary in 2014, which was a result of many years of work. And this has been online for the past many years, available countrywide and accessible to all at no cost, which has been a great support for teachers of the deaf, families with deaf children. We work hard to train the parents that are part of our school system to ensure that they're engaged with their children and able to help them in their education, even though they themselves are often from a low literacy sort of background. So our program has been successful. I feel it serves as a great model, but it's a small part of a huge need that exists. I think what we've created is not only replicable here in Pakistan, but in other geographical areas as well. But the second part of the topic that you gave me was talking about developing partnerships. And I think that is foundational to having a successful program that's impactful. Both partnerships with the government and partnerships with other nonprofits that are in this similar field, and partnerships in the private sector. And I think that triumvirate model of working together is a workable solution for countries like Pakistan. We've seen it work very well here. For example, we've collaborated with the Citizens Foundation, who have a large network of schools, to develop content in sign language for their Teletalim TV program, which was aired during the lockdowns to enable children at home to at least get some basic input. We partnered with Dil, who's on our panel today, to take some of their amazing content, which they've created, and we simply filmed and edited in the Pakistan Sign Language, thus making all their content available. We've done the same with content from Sabak. And we've worked together with Omer from Now PDP and with Raza. All of you are panelists here. Raza from the corporate sector, Omer from the nonprofit sector, to create partnerships that open opportunities to have a greater impact. We've done the same with the Sindh government, the Punjab government. They've provided locations, buildings for us where we can house our schools. So all that to say, I think these type of partnerships are very key and foundational. Amina touched on that in her introduction. And I think by having greater collaboration and discussion, this is a positive way forward in this field. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, for shedding light on those two facets. I'd like to now introduce Fiza Shah, CEO of Developments in Literacy. But before I could proceed with her introduction, Fiza, thank you for joining us so early in the morning. From your side, I think she's the one panelist who had to get up the earliest and start off. But before we proceed, I'd like to point out that I have been following DIL's curriculum development and cutting-edge technology solutions for the past couple of years. And I'm very proud to say that very recently, FESF, the Deaf Reach program, has also partnered with them to test and iterate their digital resources and adapt them in a sign language curriculum. So I'll be sharing a little more about that in our conversation as the morning goes along. But to come back to Fiza's introduction, she is the CEO of Developments in Literacy, DIL, which she founded more than 20 years ago. The aim was to provide quality education to underprivileged Pakistani children. And I don't say this lightly or loosely, but she has successfully established hundreds of schools, educating tens of thousands of underprivileged children with a special focus on girls. And these schools are found throughout Pakistan in the provinces. FISA has led DIL to produce a transformation in student learning through innovative and cutting edge technology solutions. So today we're very honored to have her as part of this panel, and she'll be speaking on the importance and impact of digital learning resources to improve student learning outcomes. Thank you very much for joining us, FISA.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me clearly.
Absolutely.
Great. So it has now been over 20 years since I started Developments in Literacy, with the vision that all Pakistani children must have access to quality education so that they can realize their full potential. But in time, it became obvious to me that to achieve this goal and to enhance the classroom learning experience for students, it was essential to incorporate digital content. However, we had started exploring the potential of the video lesson modality of instructions back in 2013. And in that time, we had developed a mobile learning program to strengthen teachers' concept clarity and knowledge gaps that could not be properly addressed during pre-service and in-service training. Unfortunately, most rural Pakistani teachers are the product of a failed national system, mired by poor quality and ineffective teaching practices. The video medium allows concepts to be demonstrated in a way, in ways a one-dimensional textbook cannot. And it's an excellent learning opportunity and resource for teachers. So we provided our teachers with unlimited access to instructional video lessons in math and English via smartphones. The results were amazing. We saw a 47% growth in their content knowledge. Our second technology-enabled intervention was our e-libraries for rural school program. We called it Read to Grow, Read to Know. It was designed to accelerate English reading development and comprehension of our students, a skill all children must master to succeed academically in Pakistan, where higher education is in English. The approach of our e-libraries program is to instill in our students the joy of reading and ignite in them an internal motivation to read, with the understanding that the more children read text that is at their ability level, the more capable they will become at comprehending more complex reading materials down the road. This pressing need for plentiful level books resulted in the creation of electronic libraries accessible through tablet devices, a great alternative to costly investments in library infrastructure. For this initiative, starfall.com generously provided DIL access to the vocabulary control e-stories, which comprise the core content of our program. After using tablets offline for 8 months, students' reading comprehension improved by an astounding 217%. And then inspired and encouraged by the success of mobile learning and e-libraries, DIL embarked on its latest endeavor, technology-enabled academic learning, what we call our TEAL program. TEAL uses Android tablets to bring videos and assessments directly to students to support core subject instructions in the classroom. We learned quickly that curating open education resources from the internet would not be an optimal solution for our population. So we started creating video lessons in-house for middle grades actually we made them on every government mandated SLO for math, science, English, and Urdu. These videos are accompanied by lesson plans that include student-centered learning activities and are supported by teachers' guides that we've been developing for many years now. TEAL shifts the function of the teacher from direct instruction delivery to guiding students in constructing their own understanding through videos, activities, and formative assessments. It is designed to ensure students come away able to meaningfully apply their learning. Most importantly, this program is structured to ensure that teachers address the needs of every child. And keeping in mind that a tablet or other such devices also encourage self-directed learning, and students become an active participant in the learning process rather than the passive learner found in lecture environment. And then accompanying interactive lesson plans bring conceptual subjects like math and science to life, making them fun and engaging. And access to the internet also provides students and teachers a broad range of additional resources to conduct research. Another important point is that programs like TEAL help standardize quality across schools. In 2020, we shared our learning videos with the Federal Director of Education, which was subsequently shown on their new television channel acquired to provide quality education and support independent learning across Pakistan during lockdown due to COVID. And this is the same program that Gary had also just mentioned a few minutes ago. So quality learning videos have tremendous potential in that they empower students to take control of their own learning. And when videos on an individual device, students can pause the video when needed and rewatch sections, we believe that this feature can prove particularly useful for students with learning disabilities. For example, students who may be reading the sign language insert would also benefit from viewing a video or parts of a video more than once. The digital learning, I believe, can easily be adapted to the learning requirements of students with disabilities and also help unlock their academic potential. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiza. One of the most interesting facets that we've realized in our partnership with DIL at FESF is that there's so much integrity and thought behind the structure of these programs. It's not a cookie cutter approach, it's very organic. And that's what we're trying to assimilate in the systems that we develop. So I think this is a very important aspect in our overall conversation. Where do the beneficiaries fit in and who are we actually doing this work for? And more on that end, I'd like to introduce Umair Ahmed, who is joining us today. He's the Executive Director of Now PDP, a disability inclusion initiative. Umair is a social entrepreneur, organizational development specialist, and a capacity builder with almost 15 years of experience. Umair believes in assessing, channeling, and implementing objectives of those who choose to strive and further the rights of the disenfranchised. Today, Umair will be speaking on the employment challenges for PWDs and how technology can help build employable skills. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing about what you're doing.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, panelists. It's a pleasure to be here on behalf of Now PDP. I must extend my very warm thank you to the United Nations as well for allowing us to be part of this conversation. It's been enlightening to listen to all the panelists talk about the challenges in education that have been faced, particularly for the deaf students, as well as how integration of material for other disabilities can somehow be managed through the work that is being done by DIL. On our spectrum, we have been working across all disabilities, and we try to work on economic empowerment, skills development, and education. And our goal and objective is to have holistic inclusion happen at the institutional level, societal level, and individual level. 2020 and the onset of COVID for Now PDP and its mandate was an interesting time, because I think there were positives to glean along with the negatives that were there as well. I just want to take a quick step back and look at one of the questions that was posed to me as regarding this conversation. What was the overall impact of disability on persons, or of COVID on persons with disabilities? And I think it was less so about the unique impact. It was more so about the magnitude of impact, both on the positive side as well as the negative side. I believe that access to identity, shanacht, persons with disabilities have a hard time getting access to shanakhti cards, or the national identity card of the country. And this became even more cumbersome and impossible because the government departments responsible for handing out these cards were inaccessible or shut down. So if you were trying to access ration, benefits, at a time when you were locked down, you could not get access to your identity to prove that you're a person with disability. Access to education that Richard alluded to was another big challenge. Special education schools have the ones that are the most, less adept at technology. And they're the biggest challenge in pivoting towards technology to include persons with disabilities. So that was one of the big challenges that we faced as well. When it came to our line of work, skills development leading to a job, we realized that skills development on the white collar front was easier to transition to online classes. Retention improved, surprisingly, because there was no longer the hassle of transport or people having to come to a center which was far away, and they could utilize their own mediums and modules or laptops and their own devices. But this was only for those who had access to computers and laptops and internet and were working on white collar jobs. On the blue collar front, this challenge was exacerbated because most of the jobs that we identify or we find are in the textile sector or like sectors, and those need in-person individuals to be present and for them to be trained or to have their job. One of the other challenges that we realized was that transport was absent. And as a result of a lack of transport, we saw that different disabilities adapted differently. Visually impaired individuals, blind, were very used to Careem, Bikea, which were ride-sharing applications that they had become, they were using to get to work. These were completely off the street. So for visually impaired individuals to get to work became next to impossible. For the deaf community, this was a little easier because they had access to licenses, and most of them or some of them could access their own transport to get to point A to point B or to their jobs. For physical disabilities, it was neutral or a bit more of an impact, but not as much as visually impaired. Because what we realized was that people with physical impairments have already had challenges with public transport and the transportation system. So a lack thereof on the streets did not hamper their coming and going from a place of work. The biggest challenge that we saw was from the employers, who became even more reluctant to bring people with disabilities on board. And this reluctance not only was for people that they wanted to bring on board with disabilities, but also those that they had on their payroll, who were one of the first ones to be let go. Because it was quickly realized that they were redundant to need, and thus they were let go. And this again is from the section and segment of society that we were trying to access, which were more blue-collar jobs. Small businesses on which a lot of persons with disabilities relied for their own income and livelihood were shut down. And as a result, the subsequent unemployment and the lack of resources was further exacerbated because they could not even earn from a choti si dukan or a little shop that they had at the end of their neighborhood, or the one that they were trying to run through their own private enterprise or through online classes. I think one of the big challenges or one of the big areas of opportunity that we saw was that some organizations actually pivoted very quickly to moving their interviewing processes, their job roles for persons with disabilities to online. And there were some very good standout examples for us, particularly, where we saw a more engaged audience when it came to jobs or interview processes, that people were taking in more active interest online to conduct interviews. And as a result of this, we realized that some disabilities had an easier chance adapting or easier task adapting to COVID and economic empowerment than others. And the sense of community, and this is one thing that I wanted to highlight, was where we had the most difficulty. Because in most disabilities, and I think Richard and can also vouch that in the deaf community, a sense of community prevails, which allows them to support each other when they are jobless or they are without opportunities. And that was taken away from them because they could no longer interact with those who were in similar situations or who could give them confidence boosts, who could support them in this time of need where they had no access to economic empowerment. So all in all, the biggest challenges that we felt, we realized on the economic empowerment front, employment front, were the hiring freezes, the reluctance of employers, the lack of transport that was there for people to go back and forth from work, and the elimination of small businesses that were a source of livelihood for a lot of these individuals. Thank you.
Thank you, Umair, for giving us insights on the impact, like you said, not just pre-pandemic, but post-pandemic. The biggest change in employability and the infrastructure changes that are required are not just an overnight solution. all these challenges have been building up over the past. And you touched on one aspect about the impact on community. And that, I think, is the point that I'd like to highlight upon when introducing our next panelist, Raza Pirbhai. When I think of a brand and a brand's integrity and its excellence, I often think about the connection with the community. Raza, in my experience and in my short time of knowing him, has to me proven to be a very pragmatic and driven executive who is sort of one of the most clear and visionary corporate executive who has a vast experience of 20 years. But he not only is he just doing the executive management in multinational companies, but also developing strategic goals which have a keen focus on transferring their brand integrity and excellence to the community. And I think one of our most successful partnerships in the corporate sector have been with KFC, which has transcended from being Pakistan's favorite fast food brand to an organization that supports livelihood, income support, and education. I'd like to call upon Raza to touch upon the topics and share with us the regional insights, the programs, and plans that are being implemented by KFC Pakistan to foster an inclusive work environment for PWDs. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, all of you. Very respectable panelists and the very respectable group of individuals from all across the geography. Thank you for having me. I'm a corporate guy. I don't do a lot of social what you guys do, interesting things, but I just want to explain that for the last 7 years, we have really been doing this very rigorous inclusion plan that we have been running in our organization. And I think this has really to do, to be honest and open, with Richard, who I actually kind of partnered with us and got us into this. And that's how we opted for it. And then, initially it was a very difficult thing that, how do you really kind of include such people into your workforce? But we always had a good intent, but never had the idea how it's actually going to work. But when we got into it, I think it has really helped us as an overall organization, because we have been trying to transform this organization for the last 7 years. And this, including this workforce of people with disability, has played a very pivotal part. What it has actually played how it has actually played a pivotal part is because the normal workforce, when they come out of their comfort and they have to work with a little bit of a discomfort, I think that has really kind of helped us in creating the overall transformational culture that we wanted to develop. So we are running this, we partnered with Deaf Read School, and we kind of sponsor now, and we run a Deaf Read School with Richard. Along with that, once we kind of got into educating the disabled individuals, there was this thing that how do we create employment for them? So, when they get out of the school, where do they really go in, and how do you really kind of include them in the normal society? So then we partnered, and we now have 7 dedicated deaf stores, which are primarily being run by 80% of deaf staff. And we have 2 deaf individuals at each of our 100 stores now. So we have a huge workforce of disabled individuals who are working with us. What we have found them, interestingly, is that, yes, it was difficult for us to kind of train and come up with the entire curriculum. How do you translate it? How do you actually make them understand the trainings and all? We really had to change and revise certain processes, because now they've become a huge part of our workforce. So we had to change all that, according to, for example, like our fryer system, our frying system is such that it used to just have those, it would make a sound once the product is ready. We had to change that. Now it lights up, right? So there's a light that comes out so then individuals can actually see it. So we did a lot of work on in terms of revising our processes, revising our training materials, getting help from Richard and the team, who are actually helping us to train our people in sign languages. One of the most beautiful work that has actually been done by FESF is developing this sign language and the digital sign language. And not only that, that they worked with us in terms of training our team on the sign language and all, but they actually helped us build this sign language and educate this sign language to our customers as well. So if you now go in the KFC restaurants, there's a sign language whereby you can actually learn the sign language and order. And then, so that model has actually, so this has worked out fantastically for us, I tell you. Now we have a beautiful 7 dedicated stores which are run by deaf individuals. We have a deaf cricket team that plays deaf cricket. So the overall, this partnership has worked out very beautifully for us. What it has done is that, and especially the stores where we have these deaf individuals who are working, we see less of attrition, there's less turnover, they are very well committed, they work diligently, they work much more better than the able people, right? Because you know that they are marginalized, they know that they don't have much place to go, so they are really, really fully committed to their jobs. They work very diligently. And so this program keeps growing year on year. Richard keeps coming back to us with different ideas. We keep engaging with Richard, and this program is growing. It wasn't really well thought initially when we began. It was just the thought was the right intent that we had. What initially Richard mentioned, that this public, government, and this social organizations needs to work together to actually include this marginalized community. And I think we as an organization, we were working on education and diversity before, and then this was the important pillar which was being missed, which we always had the right intent. And with the right kind of partners that we got now engaged with, I think this is really fostering very well. It has become one of the successful model across all this restaurant industry. It's now been copied, in many different KFC markets, and it is beautifully growing. So we now not only work with one institution like Richard, we have actually expanded also, because Richard has actually given us so much of fire now that this program is now growing. So I see that the corporates, if they have the right intent to include this community, I think this becomes really workable, and it's a beautiful program. So thanks, Sarah. That's all from me. Unless you want to understand anything more, I'll be happy to share.
Thank you, Raza. I think there's always more to talk about and more to learn. So I think we can carry this conversation forward now and assimilate all our thoughts and viewpoints in the next segment, which is the Q&A. I have a couple of questions for each of the panelists, and I'll be addressing you one by one. And following that, what we can perhaps do is, I see in the chat box some questions from the audience. We'd like to take some of them also if time permits. So I'd like to, in fact, ask my first question of Umair, leading further to your comments earlier. And my question to you today is, in what ways does COVID-19 and any accompanying restrictions uniquely impact PWDs? I know you touched on it briefly, but I'd like you to elaborate with certain examples on ground so that we can really understand what it is like to be a beneficiary or someone who's been impacted with this changing world.
Thank you, Sarah. And when it comes to the holistic inclusion of persons with disabilities that I was alluding to earlier, now PDP's work for the last 12 to 15 years has been focused on inclusion, starting from, as I said, identity of persons with disabilities, or Shanacht, as we like to call it, because they should have easy access to an identity of a country that they belong to and are born in. It goes on towards Talim, which is education, and which a lot of our esteemed panelists here have already touched upon, but we are looking at it holistically from an inclusive, integrative, and a special education perspective across all disabilities. Then the third step is hunar, or skills development. When a person has identity, they have education or lack thereof, what they need is an applicable skill that they can use and get a job or economic empowerment through. The fourth step, rozgar or employment, is where we feel the most ingress has been made in the last 5 to 7 years, because more corporates like KFC here, have stepped up and taken the mantle of inclusion. Lastly, we strongly believe that if you have shanaft and identity, education, skills, and a job, you are khud mukhtar or independent. And then the job comes to make sure that advocacy is happening at the highest levels for persons with disabilities to have access to people in power, as well as those who need this interest and this audience. So our work has spanned the 6 areas from identity to independence. The challenges that we have seen historically, as I pointed out in my earlier statements, were only magnified in magnitude by the onset of COVID. The challenges did not change, or the advantages did not change, but their span and their scope increased manyfold. I will touch one by one on where I felt the biggest challenges lay in the work that we do, at least. When it comes to Shanacht, I had identified that Shanakhti cards or identity cards for persons with disabilities are very hard to come by. These are a prerequisite for you to be eligible for any benefit that the government gives out if you're a person with disability. If you're a person with disability and you do not have access to a special Shanakhti card or special identity card, then you are left behind, so to speak, and you will not get access to a lot of resources that will be the difference between, not to be dramatic or melodramatic, life and death when you're shut up in a home in a rural area, as Amina was highlighting, where the urban and rural divide for persons with disabilities is significantly large. So one of the things that we wanted to do was make sure that persons with disabilities who did not have identity cards did have access to ration and food and drink and basic resources. And that was a challenge that was unique to persons with disabilities because of the scale and the magnitude of the issue. When we went to our rural areas, the rural centers that we were working with, we realized that people with disabilities had no clue about what benefits the government was providing for persons with disabilities. A person who is from a low-income background but hails from a city center might be aware of the schemes that are being run by government, but a person with disability hailing from a rural area will not be aware of these things. So the first order of business for us was to identify and shanakh these people and provide them the solution that they needed to survive in this case. The next step was Talim, education. Now this was one of our big challenges that I believe Richard was alluding to. Dil has worked on this as well. Special education schools are by and large the largest when it comes to enrolling persons with disabilities in rural centers, rural areas, as well as mostly urban areas. But they are not well versed in technology. So with the onset of COVID, when schools shutting down, these children who were otherwise enrolled in these schools had to be sent home. And when they were sent home, they lost the sense of community. That was the major binding factor for them in terms of their learning experience, in terms of what they wanted to do. So one of the challenges that we faced was, how can we pivot our students with varying disabilities to technology so that at least once in a week, we have a check-in with them so that they are allowed to see their other colleagues, their students who study with them, the teachers that they gave them a sense of familiarity, and at least engage with them to have some learning outcomes. The other area that we felt we had a big problem in was access to skills development. As I said, here I want to draw a distinction between white collar and blue collar, as I was alluding to before. For white collar skills, this transition was relatively easier because we had computer-based skills that could be moved to this, and we could train persons with disabilities while being remotely connected with them. But for the vast majority who are dependent on blue collar jobs, this was not a luxury they could afford. And as a result of this, they were left behind. And that was a big challenge for us to make sure that we were connected with them somehow to keep the confidence high and the morals up. So skills development was different for persons with who were working on white collar jobs versus blue collar jobs. Access to rehabilitation was a challenge, or habilitation in this regard, across all disabilities. When we talk about intellectual impairment, they are very dependent on their therapists, on those that are training them, on those that are helping them out. When it comes to Down syndrome or other disabilities, they lost access to a lot of these people. And the challenge here was that how can they be reconnected with a lot of these individuals? Because the therapists, if they're not having access to those they're helping out, the beneficiaries, they regress very rapidly, very quickly, and they lose whatever momentum and development that they've built out. So a unique challenge that we felt with intellectual impairment was a loss of habilitation and rehabilitation. But on the flip side, the unique positive impact was that we were able to create mini therapists. So we were able to see mini therapists being created with parents and family. As Richard was pointing out, they were before not involved in the child's development, but they were required now to step up and actually be actively involved in the children's life. So that was a big plus that we saw. So on the negative side, they lost access to therapists that were well-versed. But on the positive side, and the flip side of it was we managed to train families, or our partners managed to train their families to become more involved in their children's lives and their children's development. A lot of knowledge was transferred. Another positive impact was a lot of knowledge went on webinars and content that was being developed by different organizations, DIL, FESF, KDSP, organizations that work on various disabilities, and was given with easy access to persons with disabilities. So a lot of learning came about in the early days of the lockdown, which was uniquely impactful for persons with disabilities. Why? Because usually they were not relying on digital content, either offline or online. So this was a huge benefit that we saw. I think one of the things that I feel we need to step back and look at is that there is a mixed plate, an irony of situation, that the societal ostracization of persons with disabilities was a good and a bad thing, because persons with disabilities are usually ostracized from society and they are confined to their communities. So as a result of this, the impact on them in some cases was not as big, because while they were confined to their houses and their homes and their neighborhoods, they are used to this ostracization, which has a far bigger impact on them, and everyone else is socializing and they're stuck. But this time they were one of the many, and so the equity there was for everyone to see that the challenge there was not as big as we otherwise thought before. I touched on the unique elements from an employer perspective. The negative of it was that unlike KFC, which is, a standout employer and an ideal employer, there was a lot of employers who relied on blue-collar skills that took this as an opportunity to step back from their commitment to persons with disabilities. And this is not meant to be a large criticism, because they were hard times, but the people that were the most to suffer during this time were persons with disabilities, because they were thought redundant to needs very early on. And I think that was a big challenge that we faced, to convince employers to keep persons with disabilities on their payroll, to see out this time so that they could see the other side. Because one of the areas that we do highlight is the impact on morale that persons with disabilities have on the larger workforce. And for a person to be retained with or without a disability, and to be shown that to other workers, can be a source of inspiration in dark times and difficult times. So one of the things that we saw was the reluctance of employers that required a lot of effort on our part to step up. Small businesses being shut down was a huge challenge, because no food business, no roadside business was allowed to operate, where a lot of deaf people and visually impaired people, online classes, while they pivoted to that and were able to earn a livelihood, deaf people who were reliant on a lot of food-based businesses lost their jobs. Physically impaired people who were reliant on rickshaws that they were running for earning a livelihood lost their livelihood. And these were the people that we saw based on disability were the most to suffer. So just to wrap up, there was a societal impact that we saw, that ostracization impact different disabilities differently. There was an educational impact. There was an identity impact. And then there were impacts on skills development, job placement that varied with disability and by employer, but by and large was something that we feel technology can resolve and should resolve going forward.
Thank you, Mayor. That offers a lot of clarity on the impact across the spectrum of the restrictions that COVID has brought about. And you've also touched very clearly on the barriers to workplace, income generation, and livelihood. I'd like to ask you, and then perhaps lead in with Raza also answering this question. What initiatives, I mean, we know what the barriers are and what the challenges and restrictions are. So now I'd like to pose this question to you as someone who works with persons with disability, and Raza, who has a keen focus on supporting communities. What initiatives do you think can be implemented to compensate for the barriers to inclusion of PWDs and their ability to participate in the community as well as the workplace due to these COVID-19 response measures? Umair, I'd like you to take this first, and then perhaps Raza can lead in.
I will be very brief in this, unlike my previous response, because I feel they're more qualified individuals there. Some of the steps that we took and we recommend for people is basic steps. Reliance on things like Google Hangout and Zoom meetings was something that came into the forefront quite quickly for us. Our skills development training, and we bought licenses for Zoom very early on, and our skills development training moved quickly towards both for the visually impaired, the physically impaired, and the deaf onto the platforms like Google Hangouts, Zoom, and WhatsApp video. Our community outreach, where we try to identify individuals who are eligible for jobs or are in need of assistance, was dependent on WhatsApp videos. And the provision of food was also dependent on WhatsApp videos on the lists that we had done. We are actively now looking at geocoding or geofencing to identify where people are located, connected to where they can possibly find work or possibly find refuge or resources. So for example, someone located in Korangi in a 5-kilometer radius from one of the employers was quickly identified by us that once and if the COVID restrictions are raised, they can be placed in these jobs. So basically what for us worked really well is we realized that the jobs that were meant to be transitioned to digital or online, sort of participation, but would have taken another 2 to 3 years, could be moved more quickly. Marketing jobs, digital jobs, I feel call center jobs, which could also be moved there. One of the other areas that we felt, and I think Richard alluded to this, as did Ms. Fiza Shah, were the utilization of online and offline resources. So for us, job training then became a video that we could share widely across if you had access or if you did not have access to internet, so that people could learn what the etiquettes of giving interviews were, what were the etiquettes of getting a job were, how to partake in a job. So basically, to sum it all up from our end, the 3 things that we learned was use the tools that we have for meetings, digital meetings, move the jobs that were supposed to be moved online more quickly and rapidly, utilize geofencing and geocoding to connect people to close by places for job placements as well as resources, information sharing and information enhancement through webinars and blocks of information that can be shared through digital online or offline platforms.
Thank you, Umair. Raza, if you have any valuable input on this point, that if, for KFC also, the sudden shutdown of their outlets and restrictions, if we look at it from that lens, so are there any initiatives? I know KFC has already implemented a few, but any other broad spectrum initiatives that you want to shed light on, or even just the measures that KFC had taken to provide access and inclusion to people in the community to participate in the workplace?
Right, Sarah. So just very briefly that I would tell you that, our first, goal was when we got shut down and 100% of our business was been closed. So the entire, focus was, and we were very clear that, what our strategy is going to be. And we decided that brand and people are going to be our focus. And we said that we're not going to, put anybody on redundancy, and we're going to save jobs, be it a PWD or the organization overall. Our basically, commitment was that we're not going to let go any people. So we wanted to save job, right? So that was one thing that we did, and we were very successful with 1 month or over 1 month of closure when we were not even allowed to operate our delivery business. We got shut down, but we retained everybody. In that time of retention, the idea was, how do we really engage with our people? We didn't really wanted to leave them just like that, be it the PWD or our normal employees. So all our learning and in all the other initiatives had actually moved on to online, and we were engaging with a lot of trainers, global trainers, local trainers who helped us in engaging with our community, with our KFC community. And I'm saying, so what we did was unique was that, in the normal course of our webinars and learnings, what we introduced was the sign language along with that. So all the learnings that we had for the normal audience basically had the interpreter in those learnings as well. So that kind of really created what Omer was saying, that you don't really leave them out as a community, right? You want to include them in, and you want to keep them together. You don't really want them that, okay, it's bad times and you you just let them go. So entire organization was being then kind of held together. We were hosting what we were hosting for the normal audience. We were hosting the similar kind of learnings and everything for our disabled community as well. Then what happened once we opened back, what had happened was that because of the restrictions, various restrictions and all, the entire learning system had actually been moved on to e-learning. So with that, when we moved on, the initial hiccup that we were facing is, how do we develop a curriculum for the disabled community as well, because they need to be engaged as well. So very quickly, we had to really kind of get into that as well and develop their curriculum along with the learning of the normal audience. So now all our learning, all our training is basically is moved on e-learning. And in that, the entire content is now available for the disabled community as well. So that was being very quickly done together. I think that was the kind of initiatives that we took, during the times of COVID. We did not let go anybody. There wasn't really anything like that, what May mentioned. I know a lot of employers did that, but because they were under immense pressure. But we had no plans to kind of get, our disabled community redundant or anything of that sort. Was never the PM plan. In fact, we have included now, we have created more job opportunities. We recently opened a couple of more stores. We've included more, disabled community members, just like the way that we've added more people to our team. So that's what Sarah we did.
Thank you, Raza. Thank you. I'll be switching between questions regarding employment, education, technology, and access, so that we can have a mix of ideas and thoughts coming out from this conversation. My next question comes to you, Richard. What impact has COVID-19 had on accessibility to education of persons with disabilities?
That's a very big question. I think a very short answer, it was like a massive wall that just rose up and brought everything to a halt. Obviously not just in Pakistan, but worldwide. But how we felt it here, particularly when the lockdowns started and all the schools closed, already these children whom we've identified as marginalized and missing out, so many of them missing out on the educational process. So the ones that were already out of school, life just continued as was. But for those kids that had the opportunity to come to school, and I refer basically to our schools here, as I mentioned, we have 7 schools in 7 different cities. This was a massive event change for them. as I shared earlier, deaf children in their homes are also isolated due to the language barrier. Pakistan Sign Language is not, keep in mind, sign language is not universal, it's unique to every country. Deaf people communicate in their native language, but their family members, for the most part, don't know that language. We have a parent training program. We work hard to get our parents to engage with their children, but it's not at the same level when they're in school, surrounded by their peers, with their teachers, and communications are flowing freely. So one of the first things that was of concern to us was the loss or the erosion of their language skills being left out of the education for such a long period of time. Because the closure was not just for a few weeks or a month, it's been ongoing for many months. Online learning is not really an answer, because the children whom we're working with, we did a survey actually of all their homes just to find out less than 15% had access to internet bandwidth. And even those that didn't have devices in their home. So that was a non-issue. And as a result, what happened, since this was continuing on, we came to know that many of the parents basically, who had, in a sense, sacrificed to allow their children to go to school. In many of the families where our children attend school, some of their siblings who are mainstream don't go to school because they have to help their parents work the fields, or the girls stay home and help work in the home. And this was what was happening. These children who had a vibrant sort of a scholastic engagement were now taken sort of as home workers. And a big concern is, will they be allowed to come back to school? There's projections that say up to 25 or 30% won't return to school. Now in our own school system, we'll actively engage with all the parents. We've been engaged with the parents, so we're not too worried about that. But generally across Pakistan, this is going to be a trend because it was already difficult to get those parents to allow their children to come to school. And creating greater awareness, greater understanding, these are all huge topics that need to be addressed, which Amina outlined. And I'd like to say here, we developed a solution, but I'll save it for a later question that I know you're going to ask me, and I'll share our solution.
Thank you, Richard. I think I'll take.
Sorry, can I clarify one small point? And Raza, you'll forgive me because I'm addressing something you said, because you've used the word normal a lot. And I know that's common in Pakistan, it's just a part of the language. But in reality, what we're really talking about when we talk about children with disabilities, we're really talking about children with disabilities versus mainstream children. Because normal is really, it's not abnormal or normal or hearing impaired or you know, everybody has their own community and they work in that community. So I'd like to just clarify that for our listeners, that we're not differentiating in that regard. Normal is not quite the right connotation there.
We learn something new every day. I think these are important conversations, and it helps us to draw a circle of inclusivity. Like you said, if they're part of a community and they have a certain specific language, we can all learn from this. You touched upon the fact that online learning is a difficult option for deaf children. I'd like to address my next question to Fiza, who has seen and made inroads in this area. So my question to you, Fiza, is how can organizations ensure that students have access to internet and technology devices for remote learning? And if you have any success stories to share or learnings that we can all learn from.
Thank you, Sarah. COVID actually, just like Richard said, made this disparity very clear between the poor and the rich. Although we have these wonderful videos and we had really hoped to push them to our students during the lockdown, but then we also realized that majority of them don't have internet at their homes. They don't have even computers at their homes. At the most, they will have mobile phone, because you know that smartphones are available all across Pakistan now. But even then, I mean, every family has 6 to 7 kids. I'm talking about the rural population that we deal with. And how are they going to share this one phone between so many children on a daily basis? Because even the time that it takes, you know, I mean, you got so many different subjects to deal with. So we quickly realized that that was not going to be an option during COVID. And we went on to paper, you know, sending packages of work that they needed to do at home during that time. So there was a huge loss in learning for our students as well over this 8 months that schools were closed down. And of course, now we're trying to look at remedial learning and other stuff to compensate for what they have lost during this time. So honestly, for remote learning right now for our population, this is not an option. But if you talk, if you're really talking about access in general, and the kind of work that Dil has done previously, and what, you know, we're so happy to share with your organization as well, that it is the content that's the most important, right? I mean, the access is a secondary thing. The devices are a secondary thing, but it's access it is giving them the right content that is relevant, which is relatable, which is comprehensible for them. And that we have taken a lot of pain in creating the program that we have created. But when you coming back to devices, yes, we have all these devices that we can use for these programs. And I'm going to just say something in terms of the in classroom learning. We have used tablets over the last so many years, but as we are expanding our program and starting to work with government schools, we've realized that is not really you know, a feasible option because of the expense involved in a tablet. And we are going to start using LCD screens. So of course there is one fallback of that, and that is that we will not be able to, you know, the child won't have that same kind of control on what they're learning, which is wonderful with tablets.
LCD screens.
Very interesting points here, Fiza. I'd like to carry forward something you said, that if we're talking about online learning during COVID, it can be restrictive, but our conversation here today, sure, generated due to COVID, but we're looking at solutions and initiatives that go far beyond to serve this population and the community. So here I'd like to pose a question to Richard, because we talk about different stakeholders and you mentioned partnership. As we've seen, this consortium and group of people who are sitting on this panel are all partners at some point on certain levels, whether it be for employment, advocacy, education, or consultancy. So Richard, I'd like to pose my next question to you. And would you like to share your thoughts on how the government and private sector can collaborate to make technology more accessible for PWDs to ensure their inclusion in education? We spoke about the workforce with Raza and Umair. So, you know, just briefly, or you touch on the points about government and private sector collaboration to support technology-based education.
And I'll limit my answer just to that specific area of improving technology and access, or access to technology. I just think there's a very big mountain that needs to be climbed, because the biggest problem is the lack of broadband access, particularly in rural areas. I think the telecom sector should get engaged with government support in order to provide low-cost access. And this could be not only the data packages, but the internet, but smartphones to access the internet. Because right now in Pakistan, smartphones you can get for less than the cost of a tablet or a laptop. And these can easily be utilized in families. We've tested it in our own schools. We just did a pilot test where we gave smartphones to 100 of our students, and along with a data package. And the results were very impressive to see the improvement they made during this time. And I think this brings in something Umair brought up about the ID cards for persons with disabilities. Because if the government, with the help of the private sector and people like Umair, can smooth out this process and make it much easier. People with disabilities can get an ID card, which will enable them to perhaps gain not only access, but get a discounted cost, let's say. The government already provides that for transportation, for trains and airplanes. Why not provide it also for access to the internet, for data? So I think this could be a very sort of simple thing to do if we could engage people at those levels and come up with a work plan. I think Gomer already has ideas along those lines. And a further point is that working with the government, and we're in discussions right now with the Sindh government particularly, to create learning centers where persons with disabilities, particularly children and young adults, can get education and training across a wide range of disabilities, where the partnership comes in with local organizations who have been successful in that regard, such as ourselves, not-for-profits, but with the government support, so that the funding is there in order to enable these programs to grow and reach out in the communities, particularly in the rural areas.
Thank you very much, Richard. Fiza, I'd like to talk about a little bit of your experience again. When we talk about digital learning resources, sure, for the deaf population, we'll be adding in sign language to make it accessible. But as we've seen in Omer's experience, we've got a spectrum of differently abled people. And even though the technology and the resources you have developed are for mainstream use, they have a very high adaptability. So I'd like to learn more about what the impact has been of your current experience of the adaptive digital learning resources, because this would allow organizations such as ours to think about further collaboration. Because you spoke about something that's very true to my heart: content is king. If content is king, then all else follows. Student engagement, teacher engagement, and the SLOs being implemented and achieved. So this is my question to you right now. What has the impact been of adaptive digital learning resources?
Well, when we originally made the videos, they were in English. And very quickly we realized that there was a huge issue for teachers who did not have proficiency in English. But the good thing about it, because it's so visual, that you can always, well, you guys did that, you used, you had sign language added to the videos that you're going to be using. In the same way, the language can always be changed, right? So very quickly we made the main language Urdu for the subjects, obviously for math and science, because child learns best in their own language. And across the board, the sigh of relief from the teachers was amazing. I mean, suddenly they didn't have to go to the English teacher to ask for help. They were able to deliver those lectures easily, deliver the videos easily themselves, and also their own lesson plans that accompany these videos were originally in English. And as soon as we translated them into Urdu, everything changed for them. That's one thing that we see, how easily this can be adapted to another language. And I think that's the beauty of the product, although we keep the main language English on the video, as you must have seen. Because remember, in the end, our students have to learn English. And in this world, almost, I think I read somewhere, 80% of content is in English. So those who do not know English are at such a huge loss. And so our aim has always been that, that the videos, we keep some amount of English there, and then slowly get our kids, by the time they get to the 8th and the 9th grade, to be much more fluent in English, so that they can really access the internet and get much more information beyond what we are providing to them. So yes, adaptability has been absolutely amazing. One thing I just wanted to touch on before I stop talking, and Richard had also mentioned this, that a partnership, when we talk about technology, and we talked about how the expense of data and how our student population base does not have, they don't have that income or the ability to access a lot of this information. But if we can have a partnership with telephone carriers or internet carriers, whereby certain URLs can be made free, this is a win-win for both sides, because our students then are able to access the websites that would give them the right information. At the same time, the wireless carriers would gain many more users, because this would be something very attractive for them as well. And we have been in conversation with a few of them, and I do see this as the future, because this is what's going to make education accessible to all.
Thank you, Fiza. Already, as a moderator, I cannot stop to take too many notes, but I quickly wrote this one down. That brings in such a succinct request to data service providers. We've been thinking of how inefficient it would be for them to provide free data to our students, but to make certain URLs free and provide access to curated content for them, I think it would go a long way. And I think this is where I would like to lead into my next question to Richard. What solutions can technology provide for distance learning for PWDs?
Thank you. That's a great question. And I just read a quote. I was reading a report done by the World Bank recently, and I just found this quote, and it struck me. It said, "For most people, technology makes things easier. For people with disabilities, technology makes things possible." And I think that, in a nutshell, sums things up when it comes to creating access that ultimately leads to inclusion, and particularly in the area of education. So I'd just like to share an innovative solution that we came up with in our deaf reach schools. We were hugely challenged when obviously COVID hit and the schools closed, and our parents were desperate, our teachers were desperate. Similar to, as Raza shared, we weren't letting anyone go. Our schools had downtime for a couple months, and we were like, what can we do? This looks like it might go on for a while. Let's take this challenge. And as I said in the beginning, huge challenges create opportunities also for change. So we had the concept to develop a distance learning program for our students. Now, there was huge barriers there. None of our kids had devices. It would mean literally starting from scratch to get devices, give them to our kids, to create content in sign language that would be relevant for them. And we're talking about across 12 grades, from grade 1 to grade 12. But we tackled that thing, and with the teamwork of all of our 150 plus teachers, our admin people, everybody working full time over a period of months, we developed lesson plans and presentations, and ultimately filmed the teachers signing the classroom content with the presentation next to it, with a voiceover in Urdu, that ultimately then would keep our kids current with their present educational level across each one of those grades in those 4 core subjects. We're still in the midst of this. We've been working on this for the past 6 months, but it's been a lifesaver. What we managed to do, donors came forth, and we were able to buy low-cost refurbished laptops and give them to each one of our children. And on a monthly basis, they come with their parents in small groups to the schools. We provide them the next month worth of content on a flash drive, which they upload. They turn in the worksheets they've worked on in the past weeks, which are there for grading and checking and consultation with the teacher. And this has just been a really exciting program that's really worked. The parents are engaged. When you see them the pictures of these kids sitting on a straw mat outside their hut where, you know, the whole family is standing around watching that child work on their curricular activities in sign language, and the children are learning sort of by osmosis as well. It's really exciting to see. So that was our solution. It's been working. We're still in the process. And the thing that I'm most excited about is not only is this a short-term solution for the COVID situation, but what we'll end up with is a repository of curricular content that we'll upload on our dedicated website. And it becomes available free of cost countrywide for any teacher working with deaf children, any parent with deaf children and their families, employers who need to access our sign language dictionary to build a bridge in communication with the people they're employing. So there's going to be so many long-term uses that will last for many, many years to come from this challenge that presented itself.
Thank you, Richard. Fiza initially commented that she'll stop talking quickly, but I'd like you all to know that if the audience comments are anything to go by, I think there's a lot more to be said in this conversation, and people are eager and willing to listen to what you have to offer today. Richard, one of your comments that you made lends me to ask you about the role of public-private partnerships with governments. From what I'm looking at right now, again, and I keep going back to this point, that the organizations that are representing this forum today have all laid really solid foundation and had a lot of integrity and clarity on the kind of work they wanted to do. So when COVID sort of started taking its foothold and anchored around, all the fundamentals that we built on in FESF, in DIL, in KFC, and in now PDP, we can see that those fundamentals allowed us to have a quicker response and a shorter turnaround time with very clear vision to sort of implement a solution, even though we were trying and testing it, all organizations. So that lends to me to ask the question, what role do private and public partnerships, in your opinion, have with governments and local actors to assist in achieving education and workplace inclusion?
Thank you. That's a great question, and I think it's such an important one, if not the most important one, for Pakistan and other countries that are in similar situations. I've been in Pakistan for 30 years now, and I've seen so often a lot of organizations do amazing work, but they do it in a silo. And there's not a lot of cross-pollination and synergy and collaboration. And thankfully, I think that's changing now. And I think Omer's been a very strong proponent of this. We've worked closely together, Raza in the corporate sector. If I might digress just for a minute, I have to give credit to Raza for really pioneering and leading the way with this employment scheme for deaf individuals in the KFC restaurants, because Raza said it's this last 7 years, and that's true since he's come in the CEO position. But prior to that, we actually opened the first branch in 2007. And things sort of went along slowly. It was very successful, but there was no growth. And when Raza stepped in, he saw the benefit, and we rapidly grew this project to now where there's 7 fully run deaf branches. And as Raza mentioned, there's at least 2 deaf individuals employed in the other 100 branches. What he did was set a model and set the pace for others in the corporate sector to open their doors and be more inclusive. And this has had a huge roll-on effect, which Omer is very focused on accessing. And right now, Omer and myself are part of a committee. We're working with all the banks, the presidents of the banks and the State Bank of Pakistan to create greater inclusion in the banking sector. Omer, now PDP, and ourselves are working with the Sindh government. We are now, in this coming month, launching a center of excellence in a small city in interior Sindh called Sujawal, where 5 organizations who work with people with disabilities, children, are coming together, supported by the Sindh government to have what we call a center of excellence that is going to provide education, training, employment. And we see this as a model that can be expanded and scaled. So in Pakistan and other countries of the global south, as I mentioned earlier, no one entity can do it alone. The government can't do it by themselves. Nonprofits such as ourselves who have expertise, but we don't have that kind of bandwidth. And the corporate sector, I think working together creates a huge synergy, which creates huge potential and possibilities. And I think what we've done here has been amazing thus far. It's always exciting to look back down and see how far you've come, but when you look up to the mountaintop, there's so much more to go. But I think it's a great start. And I think this is something that can be leveraged and grown, and we'll have more stories to tell if we come back again next year to this same forum.
Thank you, Richard. Before I close, and I'm very pleased to say that we're on time for the webinar. Thank you very much to everyone for participating. I'd like to ask Dr. Amina Zia to share some closing remarks before I end the webinar.
Thank you, Sarah. I just want to point out that, sitting here listening to this very robust conversation, makes me very proud to say that I'm from a Pakistani background, because, we're all here talking about sustainable development. DIL, KFC, now PDP, DEFREACH, you guys are all doing what is required to achieve sustainable development, and that is partnerships. I mean, I know that FESF has been working on partnerships for education, learning, and all of you guys have been doing great work. So that comes to my recommendations for moving forward is as we engaged in this very substantive conversation, we need to now find ways to maximize opportunities through this very robust public-private partnerships dialogue that we just had today. And, we know that private sector is a source of much innovation, as Reza pointed out, through the innovative workforce development, recreating systems and things like that. And, that's not an easy task. So kudos, Reza, to you and your team for taking the charge on that. So as we lead forward, where do we go from here? Let's look at inclusive regulatory frameworks, political commitments, and also socioeconomic context in mind. Let's bring in more stakeholders so we can really drive this sort of a policy platform foundation that all of you guys have created through your works and through your individual organizations. There's much more need to promote inclusion, obviously, for underserved and marginalized communities across Pakistan and across the global South. So how do we help Pakistan lead that conversation in the communities of the global South, right? So, I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunity here. There's a lot of potential here. We need to, expand our reach and also, ensure that that everyone understands the benefits of digital technology in all areas of needs, right? How do we scale up this innovation and education that FISA is talking about? And how do we scale up this redesigning of workforce systems that Raza is talking about? And then, of course, bringing in, the government to help with basic social services, as Omer and Richard, you guys focused on, towards a greater focus on STEM and commitments and, strengthening those corporations at all levels so we can facilitate this sort of a knowledge sharing culture. And build regional consensus around what needs to happen. And I think that one thing that I heard across all panelists was this need for creating sustainable infrastructure. So I think that's perhaps where the conversation, we can leverage that conversation moving forward. But anyway, those are my remarks. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Amina. Thank you to the panelists, to Mehreen for the interpretation, Amina and her team for facilitating this discussion. I think we can conclude by saying that, drawing on expert discussions from our time today, we can all acknowledge that digital technologies can facilitate an inclusive, resilient, and sustainable future for persons with disabilities. But we need to make sure that as we tackle the response and recovery of the COVID-19 pandemic, we work towards creating systems that enhance productivity, efficiency, and, as Amina mentioned, an infrastructure that is really resilient. As we can see, digital revolution has been an essential catalyst for persons with disabilities, and it can be harnessed for an improved quality of life and inclusive life for all. Thank you very much for joining us today. Let's keep this conversation going. The webinar will be available on all our respective websites in 24 hours, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.